Yesterday, professor, scientist, and commentator Dr. Vinay Prasad joined me on my podcast Bad Faith and sounded off on what the left got wrong during COVID. Let's watch some of that.
I'm sort of sympathetic to your colleagues' views on masking, et cetera. Why? Because I think that, you know, we did get it. With the progressive side, we got a lot of these issues wrong. I fear we were on the wrong side of school closure. We're on the wrong side of vaccine mandates to go to school. We're still on the wrong side of masking 2-year-olds. We're against the World Health Organization there. And we're on the wrong side of aggressively pushing a perpetual booster campaign, which is really the end game of Pfizer and Moderna and their stockholders, without holding them to task. And so there, I totally agree with your co-host. Yeah.
So this was
I'm the colleague who was right.
You're the colleague.
Ooh.
You're my co-host. So this was obviously a long, hour-long conversation where we got into a lot of the details that we discussed on the show. And what I really appreciate about Dr. Prasad is that, this isn't a kind of a flat COVID denialism or anything like that. Not that you did that either, but it's a conversation about whether or not, as the facts change with respect to COVID, with the transmissibility of the variants, with the degree to which vaccines and boosters actually prevent transmission, whether or not policy should change accordingly, and whether or not Democrats have kept up with those changes in a way that allow them to still be credible interlocutors in terms of public policy. Now, I think there's a different question that very much should be asked, which is a declaration that COVID's over going to absolve the administration of responsibility to pick up the tab for people who still continue to get sick from COVID in large numbers, who continue to be hospitalized and die from COVID in still significant numbers? Something like 7,000 people in the first 2 weeks of September obviously expired from COVID, and that's still very serious.
Yes, although we do have to be a little bit careful. Look, obviously, COVID is still having a negative health effect on people are dying who have the disease, and it would be ridiculous to say doesn't contribute to their death. But we do have to be a little 400 to 500 people still dying a day. They have COVID when they die, and probably it very well may have contributed, but they might have other. They might have other crippling health factors. Where a case of the flu might have knocked them out. They might. It's not lethal in the same scary way that you get it and it nukes your system, and that it can do that to you even if you're a much younger person, like we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. I saw a video that Dr. Prasad did on the boosters, kind of evaluating the boosters, and he's been, I think it's fair to say, a little skeptical of the need for them. And but he was saying, to be clear, there is no, for the first round of vaccination for the elderly, it is obvious. And I think it's important to state that from his even skeptical, very against mandates and skeptical of some of the boosters' perspective, he was saying that it's just abundantly clear for old people who didn't have any protection that when you were facing the original strain and the Delta strain, that sure, there are always going to be unknown variables. You don't know what side effects, or somebody could have a negative reaction, but the calculation was just very extremely in favor of giving people at risk the vaccine. But now we're getting to a place where he and others are saying, and I still think it should be your choice. Absolutely, it makes sense for a lot of people probably, but to have the requirement for younger people when you can't demonstrate a really a
community benefit.
You can't demonstrate any community benefit, and for a lot of people, you can't. I don't think you can really demonstrate substantial harm either from getting it.
Right.
But it's hard to find substantial benefit even at the individual level for people not.
And that's his point. That you have to look. His argument is that you have to start looking on an individual basis and not doing this kind of group prescriptions for all college kids, for instance, or all people who are on public transportation, or whatever the mandated group is. To say, if the benefits come down compared to where they were at the beginning of the pandemic for a variety of reasons, and if you are in a risk group where the benefits are relatively small because you are young, because you've recently gotten COVID and have the immunological benefits of having just come through the sickness, then why should you be treated the same way as an elderly person who's being recommended to get the booster for reasons that are very much beneficial and protective? And if your own benefit as a younger, healthier person who has recently had COVID of getting a booster are relatively low, then should we then have to pay more attention to the costs, the potential costs of getting the vaccine as well? So therefore, are we going to look more closely at myocarditis and some of these other things that even if they have a very small effect, if the upside is also very small, suddenly weigh more on various populations? So to have that conversation, and just to have a conversation about whether different populations should be treated differently with respect to COVID interventions, The pushback that I've gotten has been pretty
tremendous.
Tremendous.
That doesn't surprise me.
Well put. And I think this is also something that's hurting the left, which is that it is completely fair to push back, as I did in the context of this interview, on many claims that Dr. Prasad makes. I think he's more flippant about masking and the benefits of masking than I am. Regardless of mandates aside, I wouldn't be quite so cavalier about masks being ineffective when it depends largely on the quality of the mask and the compliance with which you wear it. I also have more questions about long COVID than he does. He seems to be in a position where he's like, because we don't know that much, I'm not willing to weigh it as much, whereas I feel very differently. I think, you don't want to walk down that road if potentially it could be very harmful and we could be having to pay for the long-term effects of people dealing with long COVID, paid for as a community and both financially for a very long time. However, if you aren't even willing to have a conversation, then these conversations are happening in spaces completely without the input of people with my own political ideology, the left, and we're losing ground because of it.
Well, yeah, when I was on your podcast with Walker Bragman and we were having the kind of masking and school closures debate, it seemed to me from the reaction, and you're right, I'm not in your ideological camp at all, but it seemed from the reaction that at least a substantial portion, maybe even a close, approaching half, agreed with me, or at least some of what I was saying.
There was that conversation that we had, in fact, that caused me to invite Dr. Prasad on because so many people recommended a follow-up.
Well, unfortunately for our friends over at Moderna, Biden's declaration that COVID is over has caused their stock to drop. But it looks like Biden's Surgeon General is playing cleanup a little bit after this misstatement. Who says COVID is still a top priority for the administration? Let's watch that.
Well, Willie, it's good to see you as well. I actually don't think they're all that different. What the president's reflecting is the fact that we've made tremendous progress against COVID-19. We're in a very different place now than we were at the beginning of this pandemic, with significantly lower death rates. We have all of our children back in school. We have people able to go back to work, families and friends able to see each other. But he also said, we have more work to do on COVID, and that's right. And that's what Dr. Fauci and others have expressed as well. We're losing about 400 people a day on average for this virus. We need to get that number lower. We have people who are struggling with long COVID. We need to understand more about long COVID and how to prevent it. And we also, thankfully, have a new updated vaccine that's available that can extend people's protection, strengthen their protection against the worst outcomes of COVID. We need people to take that vaccine. So there is more work to do, no doubt. But we are in a much better place than we were at the beginning of this pandemic.
So I don't know. Do you think he's just defending Moderna's bottom line here?
Look, it's one of these frustrating situations where I think it is both true. One of the things I think is most compelling about what Dr. Prasad has to say is the extent to which there is a confidence in the health benefit of having 20 consecutive boosters for COVID. That without any attendant pressure for the scientific community, for the pharmaceutical community, to have to run human trials and prove that there aren't health risks there. At the same time that there is a confidence that getting COVID 20 times in a row, as is likely to happen over the course of the lifetime, is going to be a health problem.
Right.
And what I think a lot of people want is for the scientific community to be made to prove its case, since we are now out of this exigent time in the first months after COVID where we're just struggling to get a vaccine, and we would have taken any vaccine and everybody was happy to have it. Now, it's not, to me, so much a question about whether or not COVID is over, but whether or not we have the space to have a little bit more scrutiny than there was time for before.
And can't we just recognize age difference? I can accept, probably with the current evidence that we have now, that if you're 85, that maybe getting a COVID booster every year is in fact the best idea for you. Like, I get that. And also at that range, at that age of your life, we're looking just how to extend your life. I see the argument, because that is the population that's really affected by the disease. But if you're going to say there's no way that's necessarily the same calculation for a 14-year-old football player, isn't it obvious that there might be some difference in expectation and what makes sense? And you hear that from people like Dr. Prasad, from us, from other people who talk about those things. I would like to hear that more from the administration as they continue to talk about the benefit of the boosters.
Yeah, and I do think this is political. Biden signaling that COVID is over means he is absolved of his responsibility to provide COVID support. So I know that you said on your radar, and I think that there's some truth to, COVID emergency powers being the hook for various kinds of interventions. Whether or not we agree on whether Biden really wants to cancel student debt is a whole other question. But I am very, very concerned that there's not a middle ground that's being charted where you can both have a critique of the pharmaceutical industry, be skeptical of some of the maximalist approaches to COVID. At the same time, I think that it should be very much in the public front of mind to continue to put pressure on the administration to deal with the people who are still suffering from the consequences of this. The fact that they're older is an excuse not to care. The fact that they are disproportionately immunocompromised is an excuse not to care. And the fact that you were not mandated to do things doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be doing the best that we can to protect members of our own community. And I don't want there to be slippage where you can't hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time.
All right, well, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us. Oh, and check out that episode if you're interested we're on YouTube, on wherever your
YouTube,
podcast
Patreon, wherever podcasts are found.
All right, stay with us.